Welcome everyone to the first in this online series of lectures hosted by the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. The series is an output of the Centre's recently launched Rethinking Hinduism in Colonial India project, directed by Dr. Arun Brahmbhatt of St. Lawrence University, Dr. Avni Chagh of the British Library, and myself, Lucian Wong of the OCHS. As indicated by its title, the aim of this lecture series is to explore new directions in the study of what has come to be known as modern Hinduism, a category that has long dominated scholarship on Hindu traditions in colonial India. In brief, deployment of this deeply value-laden category has often entailed the privileging of a narrow list of figures and institutions perceived to betray the workings of an Enlightenment-inflected rationality and its reforming impulses. Not only has this resulted in a rather attenuated image of the colonial Hindu landscape, but has also produced seemingly endless variations on a well-worn tradition modernity motif, creating what could be described as a distinct sense of repeating déjà vu for many of us attempting to navigate our way through the literature in this scholarly domain. Recent years, however, have seen the burgeoning of a body of scholarship that is sought in various ways to interrogate this entrenched paradigm. And this series of lectures sets out to showcase and examine some of these exciting developments in the field. As our first speaker in the series, we are very honored to welcome Professor Brian Hatcher, Packard Professor of Theology at Tufts University. Professor Hatcher's research focuses in sum on the transformation of Hinduism in colonial and contemporary South Asia, with a special interest in the region of Bengal. It would, of course, be somewhat misleading to characterize the attempt to challenge entrenched paradigms in the field of modern Hindu studies as anything discernibly new in Professor Hatcher's work. Indeed, whether through his concept of vernacular modernity, modern Hindu eclecticism, or bourgeois Hinduism developed in some of his major publications, Professor Hatcher has continually sought to interrogate received frames in this area. Nevertheless, it is his recent monograph, Hinduism Before Reform, published in 2020 by Harvard University Press, that stands as what is perhaps his most ambitious attempt to do so yet. On one level, the book offers the first in-depth comparison of the early histories of the Swaminarayan Sampraday and the Brahmo Samaj. On another level, through this innovative comparative exercise, the book performs the exceedingly difficult task of undertaking a history of Hindu religious development in early colonial India, unencumbered by the evaluative baggage of the liberal discourse of reform that is weighed so heavily upon work in this domain. And in doing so, Professor Hatcher has provided a model for what genuine disciplinary reorientation could look like in the field. Drawing on this recent landmark work, he speaks to us today on the theme of modern Hinduism before reform. Before handing over to our speaker, just a few final words on formalities. If everyone attending today could please ensure that their microphones are kept on mute throughout the duration of the presentation. There will be an opportunity to pose questions to Professor Hatcher in the Q&A that follows his presentation. These can be posed either in writing through the chat or directly by raising your virtual Zoom hands. And finally, today's talk is being recorded, but the Q&A part of today's session will not be published in any form, so please don't let that hold you back from asking questions. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Lucian. What a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak in this venue on this occasion. I kind of feel like it's a kickoff for a major project that you and Avni and Arun have been overseeing on rethinking modern Hinduism. So I'm really excited to have a chance to throw my 2 bits in and talk a little bit about Hinduism before reform. I want to thank the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies for hosting this event virtually, and also for hosting me back in the spring of 2019 when I was actually finishing the book. It was just kind of getting sent off to the press. At that time, I spoke to some of the Oxford Center residents and fellows about the project. So it's nice to revisit it in the wake of the book actually being out now and talk a little bit more about it. I will say, because the book is out and has been out since the spring of 2020, it's a bit awkward to talk about it because it's been received a fair number of reviews, which I've been grateful for. It's provided me with occasion to speak on a number of in a number of different venues about the book and its project and all of that. So I feel a little like I don't want to overstay my welcome on this one project, but since I hope it to be productive for raising the kind of questions that this larger project of rethinking modern Hinduism intends to pose, I thought I'd spend some time talking around the book a little bit about what it does. And I do this with Lucian's encouragement to kind of go ahead and focus on the book and what it attempts to do. I know time is tight. I haven't time tested my remarks, but I wanted to speak generally and then throw in a few direct quotes from the book just to kind of orient readers who haven't yet encountered it. And then try to raise up from the project a few salient points if I can. So I'm just going to be reading a text, and I apologize for that. There aren't a lot of visuals to share, so just bear with me. I'll try to make it as stimulating as I can. As I say, I was speaking rather generally about what the book attempts to do and what it is. And it's really an attempt to compare two figures, two organizations, which I will refer to as religious polities, that had hitherto not really been compared in any extended fashion. And if I could read from the very beginning of the book on page 1, I start by saying, here is a strange but telling fact. Despite having emerged during the same historical moment, the histories of the Swaminarayan Sampraday and the Brahmo Samaj have largely been told in isolation from each other. And I go on to say this is a rather remarkable fact insofar as the founding figures of these two religious polities were nearly exact contemporaries. Sahajanand Swami, who was born in 1781, lived till 1830, and Rammohun Roy, the much more well-known of the two, I'm sure, born in 1772, if we take that date as the operative one. And make a note, we're celebrating the 250th birth anniversary this year, 1772 to 1833. And given this fact, it's even more remarkable when one considers that the Swaminarayan Sampraday and the Brahmo Samaj could easily claim, I think, to be among the most globally visible and politically consequential of Hindu organizations that arose during the colonial era. So we have this strange fact in our literature that hitherto no one has really spent any time directly comparing the two, nor has anyone really thought about the contemporaneity of these two figures, which once I saw it, once I saw those dates juxtaposed, it just really struck me that these two men were living in exactly the same moment, and a very consequential moment in the history of modern India, which in the book I frame as the early colonial. And I think in relation to a lot of my work, which I'm appreciative of Lucian highlighting a few titles, I guess you could say a lot of my work has been a work on the early colonial. That's in the subtitle of the Bourgeois Hinduism book. It's really the larger part of my emphasis on Vidyasagar would be looking at the origins of a modern colonial figure the bulk of whose activity was taking place in the first half of the 19th century, certainly running up to the major event of the Widow Remarriage Act of 1856. So I think what I'm getting at is I've been focused on the early colonial for some time, and the current book, Hinduism Before Reform, really gave me a chance to, I think, pull up the distinctiveness of this era, drawing on the work of people like Rosinka Chowdhury and Partha Chatterjee, to think about what's unique about the early colonial in relation to the late colonial, and to encourage us all to do a better job of distinguishing the early 19th century from the late 19th century, because these are different periods and they're different epistems, I think. And we need to attend to those differences if we're to appreciate, I think, some of the distinctive conditions on the ground, as it were, in the era that produced figures like Sahajanand Swami and Rammohun Roy. So the plan for the book was to look at the early colonial period as a way to both bring these two polities together for analysis and some comparison, and at the same time to decouple these polities from the story of modern reform, which, as I construe it in the book, is a kind of back projection from the late 19th century, from the late colonial moment onto the early colonial moment, which, when we are subject to that back projection, we are subject to something of a distortion. And so I'm trying to find a different way to think about these two thinkers in this early colonial moment. Now, just to say a couple words about what the book is not, it's not a debunking of Rammohun Roy, nor is it a celebration of Sahajanand. It's not an attempt to flip our understanding of their relative importance to somehow say, you know, Rammohun Roy doesn't deserve to be called the father of modern India. That should be Sahajanand Swami or anything like that. It's not even an attempt to find some kind of parity between the two, as if to say they're equally important or to make normative judgments about which one might be more significant. And it's certainly not an attempt as the most, I feel, misguided and jaundiced of the reviews I received was in the Telegraph by a gentleman named Vivek Debroy, who wrote a rather, I think, ill-informed and poorly considered review of the book, but he thought the whole mission of the book was to take Sahajanand Swami and Rammohun Roy, in his words, down a peg or two. And of course, that wasn't at all my intention. The book, if anything, I would hope readers would come away from the book finding in it a renewed appreciation for the innovative genius of these two figures and the striking possibilities of putting them in closer juxtaposition. But I would say that since a perception like that and other perceptions like I'm trying to perhaps invert the relative status of the two, since these perceptions could arise, it's a kind of a reminder that we have in place already some notions of the relative significance of figures like Sahajanand Swami and Rammohun Roy. And in the book, those of you who are familiar with it, I use actually Martha Nussbaum's 2007 monograph, The Clash Within, which is really an investigation of India's struggle with Hindutva nationalism in the contemporary moment. But I use it as a kind of foil to bring into view the way some of our preconceptions around modernity and reform and liberalism are deeply encoded in how we talk about modern Hinduism. And in Nussbaum's book, basically, if I can not put too fine a point on it, the Swaminarayanis emerge as reactionary and conservative Hindus and are loosely then linked with Hindu nationalism, whereas the Brahmos represent the promise of progressive reform and liberalism in India. And it's a stark contrast, and it works for her very well to make her point about the clash that's happening in India and where India should go to save itself from political disaster. So that's a story I hope the book could get back to the present moment and engage some of those issues more fully. But I found myself being so deeply drawn into the early colonial that I couldn't do all that in one volume. So maybe in a later volume, I'll return to some of that. But what we find is then we have all kinds of notions that cluster around the concept of reform, ideas about modernity, enlightenment, progress, history, liberalism, the Indian nation itself. And for me, this becomes a problem that we can think of in terms of Michael Shapiro's work on moral geographies, that we have ways of mapping the world that are really normative in their basic construction. And we have to reckon with the ways historical narratives and spatial imaginings both work together to generate certain illusions about national community. So our understanding of modernity is shaped by what Shapiro calls structures of non-recognition. There are things we decide not to see or we have been unable to bring into view because of some of the normative judgments we make about what modern India should be like. So with preconceptions of modern, progressive, enlightened, or reformed religion, we tend to begin our spatial study in Bengal, and we follow a temporal teleology toward 1947, in which spatially and temporally Gujarat and the Swaminarayanis present themselves as on the frontier, on the fringe, and in the past, as it were. They're both outside the mainstream of modernity, and they're somewhat lagging behind. So we have this spatio-temporal construction that frames our understanding of the difference between the Swaminarayanis and the Brahmos. And that to me emerged as a rather huge presupposition to then carry forward if one was going to study these traditions with any kind of analytical clarity. And it seemed to me, again, we have not really seen We have non-recognized, if you will, Rammohun and Sahajanand in their shared moment. And that moral geography that gets mapped as Bengal equals progressive, Gujarat equals retrograde, and we end up, again, putting kind of simply, we end up with a book like Nussbaum's, which very much poses a question: why Gujarat? And she's thinking about Godhra and the violence in 2002, and she's found the answer to the violence of Hindu-Muslim violence in Gujarat in the fact that Gujarat equals Swaminarayani equals the past, equals, right, etc. So there's a kind of moral geography going on there that needs to be corrected. We have to do what Shapiro calls map alteration. We have to reposition these two regions and then retell the history that helps us understand how these two regions actually come to play their roles in the history of modern Hinduism. So I begin in the book working along two frontiers, Gujarat and Bengal, and that was really exciting for me. And I appreciate Lucian's recognition that this was a rather big step for me. I'm not a Gujarat person by training, and so it took me outside my comfort zone of Bengal and required me to do a lot of reading and research around the 18th and early 19th century developments in Gujarat. And to me, that was a great experience, a real learning experience, and became, I thought, really fruitful for constructing some comparison and contrast with what was happening in Bengal. So what the goal of all this led me to realize should be that we need to postpone bringing into view a category like reform, making it operative for our understanding of this period, because it could be that reform simply wasn't a relevant or meaningful category at the time these two men were working, or at least not a useful one to really unpack the kinds of innovative work they were doing as founders of two new religious polities. The discourse of reform comes, as I've said, from a later moment in the colonial era. It's circulating in the early 19th century, don't get me wrong, but it's coming into full force as an epistemic kind of beacon, if you will, after 1850. And when we project it back onto the past, we again, we're subject to these distortions. So we postpone, if we can, invoking the concept of reform because it's not the moment, nor is it the episteme in which reform really is a useful category. And instead, well, so in order to sort of make this point, let me read from the book again. I remind us, and I borrow from Melinda Banerjee's work in The Mortal God, that in some sense, the empire of reform operates as what he calls a political metaphysics. And in that kind of metaphysical discourse, modernity is pictured, in his words, as a force providentially and rationally reordering society from above. So we have this kind of concept of the providential advent of reform, which will reshape for the better a world which is, by definition, then chaotic and ill-informed and misguided in terms of its practices and views. As I say in the book, to speak of the empire of reform, which is kind of my coinage to get at this late colonial epistemic form, to speak of the empire of reform is not merely to map the spatial diffusion of new modes of religion beyond Bengal, but it is to associate modernity and religion with a particular conception of a higher truth, a conception thought to be promoted by the monotheistic rationalism of a Rammohun, which by definition then excludes the kind of Vaishnava devotional Sampradayic religion fostered by Sahajanand Swami. And therefore, as a metaphysic, the empire of reform becomes a kind of unmarked truth that makes sense of all other religious modernities in India, whether they're revivalist, vernacular, Sampradayic, whatever. They're all marked as lesser, if not even erroneous. Okay. And we see this empire of reform emerging in full force by the late 19th century, certainly in the work of someone like Max Miller, and it operates, I would say, down to the late 20th and even into our early 20th century. But in the book, I acknowledge, as I've said, you can press the discourse of reform back earlier than Miller. You could look at Horace Hemans Wilson's 2 lectures on the religious practice and opinions of the Hindus from 1840, or a remarkable work of comparative religion from 1846 by Frederick Tennyson Morris, The Religions of the World and Their Relation to Christianity. And as I found, importantly for the linkage between Bengal and Gujarat, a book like H.G. Briggs' Cities of Gujarashtra from 1849, which scholars of the Swaminarayan tradition are well acquainted with because it contains some very important discussions of the Swaminarayan Sampraday from this early pre-1850 moment. But it very much also, if you're looking at it from the genealogy of the concept of reform, an important work that shows us how the discourse of reform is being constructed. And also, as I use it in the book, you can use it to tease apart some of the ambiguities and fault lines that actually complicate the discourse of reform. And I don't want to get into that here today, it's too much. So to appreciate the reach of this reform-based discourse and to overcome our habit of situating groups like the Swaminarayan Sampraday and the Brahmo Samaj at opposite poles of some kind of spatial temporal diffusion of modernity, I tried to bring together what has hitherto been torn asunder, Gujarat and Bengal, and explore the problematic assumption that somehow the modernity of the Brahmo Samaj is tied to its origin in a progressive Calcutta, where, by contrast, the preserved pre-modernity of the Swaminarayan Sampraday reflects its genesis in the distant frontier, if not backward, Gujarat. So instead of doing all that, why don't we put the two men in a shared spatial temporal context of early colonial modernity and explore what they shared as the articulators of two early colonial religious polities. To do this is to do the work of what I call thinking before. And in the first chapter, actually the introduction, I talk a little bit about what it means to think before, and I'll just read again a couple passages from the book. These are mostly verbatim quotes. I've redacted them a little bit for the purposes of presentation here, but from page 8. To begin with, thinking before means identifying the distinctive lineaments of an early colonial moment before the heyday of British imperialism and Indian nationalism, the very moment out of which these two polities emerged, that is the early colonial moment. Secondly, so it's kind of bringing that early colonial moment into view. Secondly, thinking before entails the decision to critically postpone or forestall the kind of historical prolepsis that would predicate the present state of affairs in South Asia on normative assumptions about India's religious past. We're taking our present, we're reading it into the past, and then we're using that prolepsis to make sense of how we got where we are. It's all fraught with assumptions grounded in our late colonial, if not 20th century moment, and preventing us from seeing what's happening there in that early colonial moment. Therefore, thinking before means asking what it might mean to contemplate the emergence of new Hindu communities, if not yet even modern Hinduism, if we don't want to say that, before the delineation and maintenance of the kinds of categorical and normative borders that have come to constrain our thinking. And if we did this, just a couple things that you might see. For instance, in 1815, it's worth remembering, Rammohun was not yet, quote unquote, the father of modern India. That's a designation that will be bestowed upon him 100 years after the fact. He's not yet even a reformer necessarily, although that word is being tossed around even in his day, and it's being applied to him. But it may not be that that's the most operative word for making sense of his origins as a colonial religious innovator, let alone his initial goals. And conversely, in the 1820s, Sahajanand could be said to have not yet become medieval. That is, he had not yet had a chance to be framed as medieval. And conversely, we could say he had not yet failed to be modern. He was simply living in that early colonial moment, taking advantage of the opportunities on the ground to develop and promulgate a new religious polity that would draw in members of the communities that he was encountering in Gujarat. So if we postpone judgments like that, we're simply prepared to see what might have been happening on the ground. And to do that, I focus in the book on the concept of religious polity as a tool for thinking about how religious innovation takes place, what material developments and institutional structures support the articulation of new community visions, and how certain kinds of figures might take the lead in initiating new associative endeavors, such as these two polities. So I'm deliberately trying to avoid the language of movement. And I was looking in Mark Juergensmeyer's Radhaswami Reality recently, and he made the interesting comment that movement is often reserved for transitional developments that have not yet fully become, say, churches, or so it's a kind of language reserved for religious entities that haven't fully congealed. I don't think that that's why I don't choose to use movement. I choose not to use movement just because it wraps us back into possible discourse around religious reform movements. So the word reform and the word movement are used very cautiously in the book. I prefer to revert to the category of religious polities, because it allows us to talk about the kinds of associations, whether Brahmo or Swaminarayani, that came into being in relation to modes of ruling authority, and that were constituted around sets of norms regulating the life of the community. I, of course, build this up using the work of Ronald Inden, who drew his concept of polity from R.G. Collingwood's work, but also the work of Daud Ali, Amrita Shodhan, and others who have helped to think about how religious lords and patterns of associational behavior can be a useful analytical framework for thinking about religion. So just very briefly, because I know time is tight, the defining characteristics of a polity after Inden and Collingwood would be the combination of a community and some kind of ruling power. It's a simple sort of formulation. A community and a ruling power. The ruling power makes the community into a kind of society that's both envisioned and led by a religious leader, which we could call a religious lord or a master, if you will, and which is continually constituted and reconstituted by the willing participation of members within the polity. One of the fun things in the book, obviously, is it's not difficult, I think, for people to think about Swaminarayan, Sahajanand Swami, as a religious lord, because he is himself a guru and a divine figure. And so the language of lordship seems to make sense. It's somewhat harder, I think, for people to think of Rammohun Roy as a religious lord, and the secular liberal presumptions about what a Brahmo is makes it difficult to think about Rammohun in this category of lordship. But of course, we're kind of thinking functionally that he operates as a sort of a lord. And in the book, I tried to show the ways in which he articulates his lordship through such things as convening a kind of a court or darbar, in which he is the leading patron for the discussion of a variety of new theological attitudes, which he will then promulgate under his auspices using some of his material capital that he has, of course, gained in this early colonial moment. So we're challenged to think about figures like Rammohun in some new ways. As to polities, Amrita Shodhan has stressed there's nothing natural about these polities. They're historically constituted as self-governing groups in which the members express their commitment to the leader and the group goals, but they also retain their freedom to opt out of that group should they decide to. And this is again situates, following Collingwood, the polity very much in history. It's not essentialized, it's not reified, it's not taken to be some kind of primordially existing thing. It is an artifact of historical agency, both the Lord and his followers. And again, just troubling the waters a bit, I try to depict Rammohun's early followers as bhaktas in order to functionally put them alongside the bhaktas who gather around Swaminarayan. Again, it's difficult for Brahmos to think of themselves as bhaktas, but following Inden, you can think of a bhakta as just a dedicated participant, a dedicated follower, if you will. You don't have to invoke the emotional language of ardent pietistic devotion to get at what it means to be a bhakta of someone like Rammohun Roy. So I think, again, functionally, this allows us to think almost like sociologists of religion about how these new religious polities are brought into being. And it, I think, helps us ask a bunch of questions, some of which I'll just list here quickly. How is religious mastery accrued? And what constitutes religious lordship? How is it expressed? How might it be challenged? What theological programs and ethical norms serve to regulate group behavior? How are codes and values promulgated to shape new kinds of habitus? And here I'm looking at the Brahmo trust deed on the one hand, and I'm looking at Swaminarayan's Shikshapatri as an important text for articulating a kind of rule of faith for a new community, which will stipulate the ways in which followers should comport themselves, both devotionally, but also in their social lives. So this goes towards the institutionalization of programs. How are these rules of life and habitus given social form in organizational roles and expectation? The sort of carving out of roles for acharyas, other forms of leaders. How will patrons be courted, and what role will the patron have in supporting the polity? This takes us to questions around material emplacement and the spatialization of these polities within a complex early colonial world that might involve temple building, parceling out of space, the cultivation of local patronage, etc. There's a lot of ways in which we can ask the same sort of questions about these two leaders in their moment and come up with some striking insights around what it meant to be a religious innovator in this early colonial moment. But moving forward, I also in the book try to arrive at a point where we can also see some difference, because as I say, I'm not trying to make the claim that Swaminarayan and Rammohun are the same person or that they amount to the same kind of figure. They both successfully articulate their polities through acts of textualization, spatialization, disciplinary organization. Their polities also, though, were constituted in ways that would diverge. And so if I can read from the end of the book now, page 243, in the Swaminarayan case, the earthly Lord Sahajanand came to be revered as supreme deity. The immanent charisma of the ruling Lord was thereby translated figuratively and theologically into the cosmic authority of Bhagwan Swaminarayan. His heavenly court then came to be celebrated and affirmed over time by honoring the disciplinary codes and hierarchical form of life first promulgated when Lord Swaminarayan lived and taught in Gujarat, as well as by the regular performance of those temple rituals and acts of devotion he enjoined. By contrast, Rammohun's efforts went toward the promotion of a scripturally valid and rationally defensible monotheistic creed. His sovereignty in turn became like that of a righteous ruler who had all along been bound to laws that were higher than himself. Never a god himself, he was only primus inter pares. But for the very reason of his being the first, he was also qualified to be the man at the helm. I'm borrowing some terminology, riffing on actually some words used by Max Miller. He was qualified to be first, which means prince in German. So also first, the man at the helm, the man to the fore, the father of the Indian nation. So we have a nice way to think about his lordship leading on towards his paternity of the Indian nation. That the precise nature of Brahmo identity remained unclear even at the time of his death is suggested by the fact that the next generation of Brahmos would have to apply themselves to framing their simple code according to which Brahmos should be guided in relation to a set of memories about who Rammohun had been. And I think this would take us to my essay in the history of religions on remembering Rammohun, where I try to show that not unique to the Brahmo movement, but it's often the case that the founding figures are created retroactively by movements trying to recover and preserve memories of what the founder had achieved. And I think the analogy with early Buddhism would come into play here, that it's a work of time to create a founder, and it took the Brahmos some time to bring Rammohun into view as the founder of their movement. So, this would allow us to say in the level of comparison and contrast, Sahajanand appointed acharyas, he parceled out a spiritual kingdom, He codified a set of his dharma, if you will, and he installed images for worship in temples. By contrast, Rammohun negotiated the purchase of property for a new space of communal non-theistic worship, simultaneously enshrining his values in a set of guiding rules for the Samaj, which are laid down in basic form in the important trust deed of 1830. So in the end, then I referred to the work of Philip Gorski on disciplinary revolution to make the point that, in a sense, we have the comparison allows us to see both Sahajanand and Rammohun are enacting a kind of disciplinary revolution, but the revolutions that they set in place, while similar, are different as well. And again, from the end of the book, this is very nearly the end of the book, page 245, 246. Just to read again, and I'm just about finished. The disciplinary revolution, to borrow from Gorski again, of the Swaminarayan Sampraday was at once both individual and communal, a form of life predicated on self-discipline and obedience to the rules of satsang, community life in fellowship, if you will. Needing no support from the state, the Sampraday developed as a self-constituting polity existing within the British imperial formation, neither entirely sheltered from nor actively engaged in the project of empire or nation. Here, I think it's important that we recognize that the Swaminarayanis were not, in their earliest days, completely disconnected from what was happening in so-called imperial or colonial India. Their lives were being impacted by the East India Company. Not the same ways, but in consequential ways, just as was happening in Bengal. So it's mistaken to think that, in some sense, the difference between the Swaminarayanis and the Brahmos is that the Brahmos were colonized and the Swaminarayanis were not. This is not the case. And in contrast to the then Swaminarayan's polity, the disciplinary revolution of the Brahmo Samaj, we could speak of the self-discipline of the Brahmo Samaj, which was no less predicated on the individual embrace of self-restraint. It did not constitute itself, however, in communal mode. Its disciplinary energies went toward refiguring the realm of the social. It came to embody a culture of bourgeois aspiration and sensibility that effectively paired personal moral restraint with public respectability, spiritual aspiration with social cohesion, albeit in a liberal mode, which had its own limitations, which is kind of where I end the book, by way of saying that it's not simply the case, to go back to Martha Nussbaum, that the problems that India faces with respect to religion are all due to the existence of so-called conservative groups like Swaminarayanis. We all know that the legacy of liberalism and colonialism is one of another mode of hierarchical disciplining of public life and religious behavior in India by elites who, from their vantage points and positions of power, were able to dictate what true and right religious and cultural life would be. And so the Brahmos are as much to be held accountable for the shape of religion in modern India as are the Swaminarayanis. And so it's this difference in the disciplinary revolutions that we should focus on, and not the question of the relative modernity of these two polities. This returns us to the period and gets us outside the episteme of the Empire of Reform. If we focus on the early colonial, and we realize that in this early colonial moment, both Sahajanand Swami and Rammohun Roy were enacting a kind of modernity in their lived contexts. Neither one was more modern than the other. They each were attempting to situate their polities following Ramadan within a larger imperial scale of forms that included other religious organizations, as well as the emergent power of the East India Company itself in the landscape. And so my hope would be that an awareness of how the Swaminarayan Sampraday and the Brahmo Samaj arose as distinctive disciplinary polities in this early colonial moment, neither one of them more modern than the other, might set up or position us to rethink that first chapter of the story of religious modernity in modern India. And I think I'm about at the end of where I want to, what I want to say. I'll just end by saying I didn't do this work out of thin air. I don't want to claim absolute originality for all this. I'm intensely indebted to a number of scholars working on the Swaminarayan Sampraday in particular, people like Shruti Patel, Avni Chagh, Arun Brahmbhatt, Hanakiam, a number of people whose work was immensely helpful to me in seeing what was happening on the ground. And at the same time, we all know, and I think the Rethinking Modern Hinduism conference that's coming up is going to help us really think about this in more detail, that there have already been a lot of wonderful work done to position groups within the narrative of modern Hinduism that had hitherto been left out of that narrative, not least the movements like the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition in Bengal. So I look back to the work of Jason Fuller, very important early on, and then some of the people following his work, Ferdinando Sardella, Bharani Bhatia, Abhishek Ghosh, Lushan Wong, have all worked to kind of open up the story of modern Hindu modernity, if you will, to get us outside some of the normative frames that have been so kind of constrictive for our thinking. Not to mention those people who have gone further afield to find understudy figures like Ramalinga Swami in the work of Rick Weiss, and communities like the Matuas or the Kartavajas, if you think of Shekhar Bandyopadhyay and Hugh Urban, to name just a couple. So I think all this work is informed by a kind of genealogical sense for the origins of our categories and the legacies of the ways in which we invoke categories like reform. And so I don't claim a radical measure of newness for Hinduism before reform as much as just the happy insight of the contemporaneity of these two figures, allowing me to sort of attempt an essay, if you will, into an exploration of what religion looked like in the early colonial moment. And with that, I think I have talked plenty and will stop. Thank you.